Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ashton Jeanty, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking about my Week 12 running back rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season, going over my top 36 running backs. So if you want to hear my thoughts on a specific player, you can travel down to the description of the video. We have timestamps available there. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel as I'm making daily fantasy football content in order to help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. So let's go ahead and begin the running back conversation by beginning with matchups based on rushing statistics allowed from weeks 5 through 11, as the most recent 6 to 7 games by each individual defense is far more indicative as to what we can potentially see going into this upcoming week based on how these defenses have performed as of late. Therefore, the Bills, Bengals, Falcons, Chargers, Cardinals, etc. are the most advantageous matchups going into the given week. And unfortunately, teams like the Chargers and Commanders, who are at the top of this conversation, are on bye, so we won't be able to take advantage of the fact that they, of course, have been terrible in terms of stopping opposing running backs via rushing statistics, rushing yards, and rushing touchdowns, but we'll still be able to feast with players like Woody Marks taking on the Buffalo Bills, or perhaps TreVeyon Henderson taking on the Bengals. Again, Alvin Kamara taking on the Atlanta Falcons. There's many of opportunities in which we could take advantage of these matchups. Just wanted to go ahead and represent some of the more advantageous and some of the more disadvantageous matchups, as I will be referencing back to these over the course of today's episode. Before I get into talking about my top 36 running backs, a quick reminder again, by subscribing today, not only do you gain an edge upon your league mates, you of course get me one step closer to achieving my goal this season on the 100,000 subscribers. I cannot thank you guys enough. And additionally, for those of you guys who want my all-encompassing rankings every single Sunday for the remainder of the season, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Betr. I'm partnering with them for the entirety of the season, not only to provide plays, but of course also providing rankings every Sunday morning. By signing up today using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of 10, and then making a first time play within a real cash play, you'll be eligible to get those rankings sent for my email directly to yours at every single position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex for both half and full PPR from weeks 12 through 18 for the remainder of the season. So take advantage of the opportunity by checking out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. And new users who sign up today using code Andrew get a free $10. Thank you very much for all the support and for using code Andrew. All right, let's go ahead and begin my top 36 running back conversation with the one and only Christian McCaffrey, coming off of a 3-touchdown game, over 30 fantasy points. Over the course of this season, he is ranked as a top 10 weekly running back in 9 of the 11 contests in which he has participated in. Again, an unbelievable season thus far from Christian McCaffrey, and now he has an opportunity of taking on the Carolina Panthers, his former team, in a revenge game. The Panthers thus far this season are allowing 14.44 fantasy points per game on average since week 5 to opposing running backs on the ground, 4.37 yards per carry on average. They've recently allowed 100 plus rushing yards to the Atlanta Falcons, Saints, Packers, and of course Buffalo Bills running backs. Those backfields all surpassing 100 yards, but also additionally this most recent week, we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons, Bijan Robinson and Algier combining for 3 rushing touchdowns. We're hoping for a very similar level of production from someone like Christian McCaffrey. Hopefully finds himself in the end zone for another consecutive week of 3 tutties. Moving on to our number 2, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, who also has himself an incredible opportunity this week taking on the Giants. The Giants are the 9th best matchup at the position, allowing 16 fantasy points per game on the ground to opposing running backs and 5.58 yards per carry on average. Recently, they've allowed 250 yards and a touchdown to the Eagles running backs, 150 in 2 touchdowns to San Francisco, 108 in a touchdown to Chicago, and 88 in a touchdown in the absence of Jacobs this most recent week. Of course, Emanuel Wilson doing majority of the damage in the second half, but ultimately, going into this week, there is an expectation that Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery should both find incredible volumes of success as 10-point favorites within the game. But Jahmyr Gibbs is a very special running back. He's coming off a performance in which he had 17 plus fantasy points and a half PPR without scoring a touchdown. Thus far this season, there have been 104 performances at the running back position in a half PPR that have consisted of 17 or more points this season. 9 of them consisting of no touchdowns. He's amongst players like Christian McCaffrey, Bijan, Etienne that are able to accomplish this on a weekly basis. Number 3, we have Jonathan Taylor, the thumbnail of today's episode, who I'm sure many of us are very much so happy to get back in our lineups. Again, thus far this season, in his last 8 performances, 5 of those games consisting of 3 or more touchdowns. Again, it's absolutely wild the level of success he found. And prior to the bye week against the Atlanta Falcons, he broke Marshall Faulk's record for the most total yards by a running back in Indianapolis Colts history. 280 plus total yards. Obviously 244 on the ground, 42 through the air, an incredible performance in which he carried many of our fantasy teams. Now he has an opportunity of taking on the Chiefs, technically the second toughest matchup since week 5 in terms of running back rushing statistics allowed. Even though, of course, this defense has been great, the elite nature of this running back position and for Jonathan Taylor makes him matchup proof this upcoming week once again. Number 4 is Bijan Robinson. Michael Penix's season-ending injury is certainly going to be something that impacts Bijan Robinson in a negative factor, primarily because the offense with Kirk Cousins is far less efficient. The one game this season in which Kirk Cousins was the starting quarterback against the Miami Dolphins was the game in which thus far this season is the lowest total yards this offense has put forth. And in that game, Bijan Robinson was not very much so relevant. I understand that, of course, Bijan Robinson can still be fantasy relevant with Kirk Cousins, as we saw majority of last season take place with Cousins under center. But with Drake London out, this defense for the New Orleans Saints is purely going to key in on trying to stop Bijan in the given week. He's going to require a lot of potential receptions, which I'm sure Kirk Cousins is more than happy to dump it off in his direction considering his lack of mobility. The Saints, again, are the 8th best matchup at the position, allowing over 4 yards per carry and over 16 fantasy points per game on the ground. We're hoping for Bijan Robinson to have himself a very similar game from last week. 100 yards, hopefully a touchdown, and a sprinkle of receiving utilization that is able to get himself into this top-tier conversation. Number 5, we have TreVeyon Henderson. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen TreVeyon Henderson score over 27 fantasy points and a half PPR. The last 2 weeks itself have justified where we drafted him this last August. Now, in the event in which, again, he's going to continue to develop upon this, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals this week, it wouldn't surprise me if he continues to jump up the charts in terms of what he is currently contributing overall at the running back position. I mentioned this yesterday during the live stream. From weeks 1 through 8 of this season, he was the number 42 overall running back. Over the course of just the last 3 weeks of efforts, it has now moved him to being the number 19 overall running back in fantasy football. The Bengals matchup this week is as advantageous as it possibly gets, as this defense has allowed over 100 rushing yards to opposing running backs for 9 straight games. This is the number 2 matchup at the position, allowing over 20 fantasy points per game on the ground, 5.81 yards per carry on average, recently allowing 101 to Pittsburgh, 213 and a touchdown to Chicago, 198 and 2 touchdowns to the New York Jets. Again, everyone finding success. And on top of it, besides the rushing success that running backs have found against Cincinnati, Cincinnati technically over the course of the last 5 games has also allowed 6.2 receptions per game to opposing running backs. Number 6, we have Derrick Henry, beginning the A tier, coming off of 5 consecutive games of 20 or more touches, and finally was able to get back into the end zone for the first time since week 8. Luckily, the touchdowns are starting to roll in his direction, and as long as, of course, Lamar Jackson continues to struggle as he has in each of the last 2 games, they'll have to continue to heavily lean upon Derrick Henry and his overall efforts. Of course, as long as the elite level of opportunity goes in his direction, especially this week taking on the Jets, a defense that is the 13th best matchup, allowing over 15 fantasy points per game on the ground, 4.43 yards per carry on average. The assumption as 13.5 point favorites going into this game is a positive run-heavy script in the favor of Derrick Henry, who should be able to rack up his 80-plus yards on the ground, hopefully some sprinkles through the air, and of course, maybe more than 1 rushing touchdown in the contest. Moving on to our number 17, we have Kyren Williams. Speaking of scoring rushing touchdowns, has scored 7 touchdowns in the last 6 games, but specifically in the last 3 weeks, post-bye week, 4 total rushing touchdowns, which is very positive, especially considering where his overall efficiency has been since the bye week. 5.45 yards per carry on average, and 3.6 yards after contact per attempt since the bye week over the course of the last 3 games, and now has an opportunity of taking on the Buccaneers, who again are the 12th best matchup, 15.4 fantasy points per game on the ground, 5.22 yards per carry on average. And in this most recent week, Josh Allen did score 3 rushing touchdowns against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but the fantasy point contributions in terms of points allowed to opposing running backs would have been heavily skewed in the opposite direction in terms of being an even better matchup had any of those touchdowns gone in the direction of course, James Cook in the backfield. Otherwise, this team, over the course of the last 4 games, have allowed a performance of 136 and 2 touchdowns to Gibbs and 147 and 2 touchdowns to Henderson. Kyren should be next for another big game. Number 8, we have Rico Dowdle. Despite the difficulty of finding success in the running game in this most recent week, the receiving utilization was at an all-time high, but over the course of the last 3 games has continued to get himself a dominant workload share within the receiving category. 13 targets, 11 receptions in the last 3 games, but this most recent game, 7 targets, 5 catches, 55 yards, that really balanced out his overall week. And if it wasn't for the fact that he stepped slightly out of bounds on the screen pass, could have had himself a receiving touchdown in this most recent game against the Atlanta Falcons. Nonetheless, they take on this week's matchup against the 49ers. Again, Christian McCaffrey will be on the other side. Rico Dowdle earlier this season broke the record of Christian McCaffrey's total yards in a single game for the Carolina Panthers franchise. Nonetheless, it's an advantageous matchup, allowing over 12.5 points per game on the ground, 4.23 yards per carry on average. Expect for a very exciting game between these two teams. Number 9, we have Saquon Barkley. Look, since the bye week, He has come off of back-to-back games of 25 plus touches. The opportunity is there primarily because since the bye week, this defense has been elite, shutting down not only the Packers, but also the Detroit Lions offenses. As long as you're able to continue to play at its elite nature, shutting down the Dallas Cowboys offense should not be a tough task considering where this defense is trending. And in the event in which we do see this Dallas Cowboys offense slow down, of course, it's going to lead to even more opportunity in the direction of Saquon Barkley. Very similar to week 1. 18 carries, 60 yards and a rushing touchdown, 4 receptions for 24 for 16.4 fantasy points against the Dallas Cowboys. They are the 15th best matchup in terms of fantasy points per game allowed since week 5. Over 14 fantasy points, over 5.5 yards per carry on average. I would anticipate this Eagles defense to continue to contribute to Saquon Barkley's rushing opportunity total, which of course in a run-heavy script should allow him to find a lot of success within the upcoming performance. Moving on to our number 10. We have James Cook. I mentioned it moments ago in regards to the potential of Kyren in the matchup against Tampa Bay. Taking on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense wasn't a tough task for James Cook, but the reality of the situation is that Josh Allen scoring 3 rushing touchdowns is not going to happen every single game. Therefore, taking on the Texans on this short week Thursday night game allows for a potential bounce back performance, despite the fact that, of course, James Cook already scored nearly 19 fantasy points because of his receiving contributions. Nonetheless, taking on the Texans is technically the 4th toughest matchup at the position, allowing only 9.63 fantasy points per game on the ground, 3.16 yards per carry on average, recently shutting down the rushing attacks of Tennessee, Jacksonville, Denver, and San Francisco. Maybe the Buffalo Bills will be their next victim, but in the event in which, of course, James Cook can put together a performance on the ground through the air and given goal line opportunities, should easily be a top 12 contributing option in this backfield. Moving on to our number 11, we have Emanuel Wilson. Now, this is under the assumption that Josh Jacobs is out in week 12 because of the knee injury. Again, we're still keeping that monitored as we progress. For those of you who are potentially picking up waiver wire options, if you have Josh Jacobs on roster, and even if you don't, picking up Emanuel Wilson in his absence would automatically make him a top 12 potential running back option, considering his contributions within this organization. I mentioned it yesterday in my waiver wire video, but I'll reiterate. In the last 2 seasons, 2024 and 2025, in games in which Emanuel Wilson has been given 10 or more touches, there have been 6 instances of that. He's averaging 12.4 fantasy points per game, and in 5 of those 6 games has scored more than 10 fantasy points. Over the course of the last 22 Packers games, we have seen the running back position, whether it be Wilson, Jacobs, or any other running back, Chris Brooks, doesn't matter. They've combined for 33 running back touchdowns in the last 22 games. Expect for a lot of success, especially taking on the Vikings matchup, who have allowed 111 rushing yards and a touchdown to Chicago, 107 in a touchdown to Baltimore, and 145 in a touchdown to, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers running backs. Recently, this Vikings defense cannot stop the run, and Emanuel Wilson will expose that once again. Number 12. We have Javonte Williams, coming off of a season high in rushing attempts. A positive game script obviously leads to more opportunity. Even though yesterday I thought he was going to go less than 17.5 potential rushing attempts, that was primarily because I thought more of that Raiders offense, which obviously did not come to fruition. Nonetheless, taking on the Philadelphia Eagles, this defense is playing at an elite level as of late. And because of that, it may lead to less opportunity in a negative game script against that defense. But earlier this season, Javonte Williams was given much of opportunity in that game with a total of 17 touches, 64 yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns in week 1 against the Eagles. Again, in the event in which, of course, this Eagles defense continues to play at their elite nature, recently bundling up the Detroit Lions running backs to 66 rushing yards, Green Bay to 76, and New York Giants to 51 rushing yards. Again, majority of the statistics they are allowing is in the receiving category. Javonte is going to really have to step up there or fall into the end zone in order to exceed the number 12 overall ranking. Number 13 is Travis Etienne. He has had 3 consecutive games of 14 plus fantasy points and a half PPR post the bye week. There's a reason why I told y'all to trade for him prior to his upcoming bye week finishing. From week 6 and 7 on those live streams, I continued to tell you guys Travis Etienne should be the guy we're going after because of the advantageous nature of his upcoming schedule. And over the course of this most recent game, coming off of 19 points, despite the fact that, of course, we saw Bhayshul Tuten have his best game as a pro with scoring, a rushing touchdown himself, over 70 rushing yards. And when I watched back the game, there was no rhyme or reason in terms of the overall deployment of this backfield. They were just going ahead and absolutely imposing their will upon this defense. And going forward with Bhayshul Tuten's injury, there may be an opportunity in which, of course, Etienne may in fact get himself more workload going forward, especially in an advantageous matchup against the Cardinals. But if in fact we do see Tuten healthy and ready to go, I still think Etienne is very much so relevant because the way in which this offense finds success is keeping the ball out of Trevor Lawrence's hands. Taking on the Cardinals, the 5th best matchup at the position, a defense nearly allowing 19 fantasy points per game on the ground alone, 4.98 yards per carry on average, recently allowing course, this most recent week, San Francisco running backs 105 and 2 touchdowns. Seattle 181 and 2 touchdowns. Green Bay 72 and 2 touchdowns. Indy 130 and a tutty. Everyone has found success against the Arizona Cardinals, so I would assume it's very likely in which Etienne does so next. Chase Brown is our number 14. He's coming off of a season-high total of 24 total touches against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense in a game in which was a highly negative game script. And because of the nature of the game script, even though he did have 18 attempts for 99 yards, 8 targets, 6 catches, 28 receiving yards. That's over the last 2 games, 22 targets, 14 receptions. And going into this weekend's game, considering the matchup against the Patriots, which is in fact the most difficult matchup at the running back position, only allowing 5.47 fantasy points per game on average on the ground, 3.51 yards per carry on average, as 7.5-point home underdogs, and the Ja'Marr Chase suspension, I would assume Chase Brown's going to have to make a lot of noise within the receiving category in order to stay relevant at a top 15 capacity, but certainly because of the overall opportunity shares of late, I do believe he's capable of accomplishing that. Number 15 to close out this tier is Woody Marks. Look, Nick Chubb's overall utilization has continued to diminish every single week, and now he has an opportunity to get a bounce back game here in less than 7 days. Of course, this most recent Sunday against the Tennessee Titans was an underwhelming performance of 5.6 fantasy points in such an advantageous positional matchup. But now you have an opportunity to bounce back against, quite frankly, the number 1 matchup at the position, allowing over 22.5 fantasy points per game on the ground, 5.32 yards per carry on average, recently just allowing 157 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns to Tampa Bay, 188 and 2 touchdowns to Miami, 104 and a touchdown to Carolina, 202 and 2 touchdowns to Atlanta. Every single backfield finding success in the event in which it's not a blowout and Woody Marks is allowed to continue to heavily run the ball. With Davis Mills starting this week, I am anticipating for this to be a lot closer of a game than it is currently projected to be. Number 16, we have Ashton Jeanty. Look, his receiving utilization has certainly saved him of late. Coming off of a game in which he had only 6 rushing opportunities for 7 rushing yards is incredibly underwhelming. So I'm hoping that the game script that is created this week against the Cleveland Browns leads to far more rushing opportunity because he is a talented running back. He just needs opportunity to lead to success. Taking on the Browns, again, considering their quarterback is most likely going to be Shedeur Sanders, I do believe this is going to be a far closer game. Yes, a low-scoring game, but as long as Geno Smith doesn't continue to throw interceptions to counterbalance the overall game and the script itself, I do believe that Ashton Jeanty will be given enough opportunity to be fantasy relevant in a top 16 capacity. Number 17 is Bucky Irving. Look, the limited participation this most recent week is promising, but again, earlier this week, at the top of the week, Todd Bowles did give us an update saying that he's going to be slowly worked into more of the overall practice this week. As to whether or not that means he's going to play on Sunday, we have no clue. In the event in which he does play, we want to rank him at a high capacity because we know what he's capable of. Weeks 1 through 4, earlier this season, 4 receptions per game minimum, scored 2 receiving touchdowns in the first 4 games, and behind this incredible healthy offensive line, of course, they are going to be able to impose their will, as we have recently seen running backs like the Seattle backfield go for 110 and a touchdown recently against the LA Rams, San Francisco 71 and a touchdown just the last 2 weeks alone. So Bucky Irving, if healthy given the opportunity, should still be relevant, but I wouldn't expect him to give the entire backfield opportunity to him alone. We should see a lot of Sean Tucker this week nonetheless, but in the event in which Bucky Irving is absent, perhaps Sean Tucker should take this number 17 spot against the Rams. Number 18, we have Kenneth Walker. Like I mentioned moments ago, the Seattle backfield found a lot of success against the LA Rams, who Bucky Irving will be taking on this week. But Kenneth Walker is coming off of one of the best weeks of his season because he finally scored a rushing touchdown in a game in which Zach Charbonnet was active on the goal line, scored a touchdown. And if it wasn't for earlier in the game having a rushing touchdown called back because of a holding call, should have scored 2 rushing touchdowns. And hopefully this is the beginning of the rest of the season for Kenneth Walker, in which he is going to be utilized not only within the receiving category, but also as a running back near the goal line. This week, taking on the Titans, the 7th best matchup at the position. I understand the Houston running backs only combined for 61 rushing yards, but we have recently seen Indy go for 160 and 2 tutties, New England 176 and a touchdown, Arizona 143 and 2 touchdowns. This is a defense that can be taken advantage of in the event in which, of course, this Seattle Seahawks team takes a positive game script lead. Expect for a lot of rushing from Kenneth Walker and Charbonnet over the course of this game. Number 19 is Aaron Jones. Look, the Aaron Jones versus Jordan Mason touch matchup from weeks 9 through 11 in the last 3 games has heavily favored Aaron Jones 44-22. As long as he continues to dominate 66% of the touches within this backfield, of course, it's going to continue to lead to success considering his efficiency in the last 3 games. Aaron Jones is averaging 5.73 yards per carry and 3.26 yards after contact per attempt, while averaging 11.6 fantasy points per game and a half PPR over the course of the last 3 weeks. This week, he has an opportunity of taking on a division rival and his former team, the Green Bay Packers, in another revenge game. As of course, we have seen last season against the Green Bay Packers, Aaron Jones averaged 12.8 fantasy points per game in the 2 matchups against them. And this Green Bay Packers defense just allowed 132 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns to the Giants, 147 and 2 touchdowns to Carolina. That's just 2 of the last 3 games. If you run the ball heavily against this defense in order to protect J.J. McCarthy, Aaron Jones can very easily be top 20 relevant for another consecutive week. Number 20 is Kareem Hunt. I wanted to go ahead and leave him at number 20 and not jump him into the C tier in the case in which we do see Pacheco returning. In the event in which he does, I do believe that does lead to Kareem Hunt maybe seeing less opportunity, but ultimately, Pacheco may be limited in his return, which would lead to Kareem Hunt probably continuing his streak of success of scoring 10+ fantasy points, as he has done it 4 of the last 5 games this season in which he has been given 10 or more total touches. And over the course of the last 16 games as a Kansas City Chief, in which he has been given 10 or more touches, 12 of those games consisting of 10 or more fantasy points. That's a 75% success rate to capturing double-digit fantasy points when given 10 or more touches over the course of 2024-2025. Therefore, taking on the Indianapolis Colts as 3.5-point favorites at home, there's a lot of potential for touchdown upside if, in fact, this is a positive game script for the Chiefs offense. Alvin Kamara is number 21. Prior to the bye week, had 22 total rushing attempts for 88 yards, 3 receptions for 32 receiving yards, and 13 fantasy points. That was the best game he has had in months. And considering the opportunity going his direction was primarily because of the positive game script against the Carolina Panthers last time out, and coming off of the bye, we're hoping that positive game script continues against the Atlanta Falcons, primarily because of Kirk Cousins. Earlier this season, Kirk Cousins, as the starting quarterback of this team against Miami, produced the worst game as an offense that the Atlanta Falcons have had. So in the event in which we do have an opportunity in which total yardage is not going to be there, the conversions are not going to be there without Drake London out there, it could be a little bit of a tough positioning for the Atlanta offense, could lead to far more opportunity in the direction of Alvin Kamara, taking on the 3rd best matchup at the position. The Falcons are allowing over 19 fantasy points per game, 4.7 yards per carry on average, and recently allowed, besides, of course, the incredible monster performance of Jonathan Taylor, 90 and a touchdown to New England, 141 to Miami, and 165 and 2 touchdowns to the San Francisco backfield. Kamara, just give him opportunity and he'll find success. Number 22 is Quinshon Judkins. Coming back down to reality over the course of the last 5 games, 4 of which have been less than 10 fantasy points, without touchdowns and targets, we're not going to see very much upside for Judkins. Therefore, taking on the Raiders offense is definitely something to rejoice about because, of course, a neutral game script will lead to far more rushing opportunity and hopefully what we're needing, which is touchdowns in his overall scoreline. The Raiders are the 10th best matchup at the position, and recently giving up 118 on the ground to Dallas, 86 to Denver, 123 in a touchdown to Jacksonville, and 111 in a touchdown to Kansas City, leads me to believe that Quinshon Judkins could very easily outproduce the number 22 rank by getting over 100 rushing yards and a touchdown. This upcoming week, just need the offense to be somewhat relevant and, of course, functionable this week. Number 23, we have Jaylen Warren. Now, earlier today, Mike Tomlin, the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, did in fact say that he is optimistic on the potential status of Jaylen Warren, but that does not mean that guarantees his potential to play. But this week, they do take on Chicago, who have most recently allowed 115 rushing yards and a touchdown to Minnesota, 91 rushing yards to the New York Giants, and 116 and 2 touchdowns to Baltimore. That's 3 of the last 4 games. This can be very much so an advantageous position for Jaylen Warren, assuming the ankle injury is not going to hold him out. In the event in which it does, of course, easily, Kenneth Gainwell has proven earlier this season that in the absence of Jaylen Warren, he is a top 24 running back, if not top 15. So at that point, we would adjust the rankings. As you're aware, rankings are always subject to change between now and Sunday. So we'll keep an eye on his overall status based on the practice reports that come out between Wednesday through Friday. But obviously, the coaching staff being optimistic is very much so promising. DeAndre Swift is our number 24. Regardless of Kyle Monangai's overall utilization, we get another consecutive game of 18+ touches from DeAndre Swift. I mean, again, 21 rushing attempts is beautiful and now has an opportunity of taking on the Steelers. And even though DeAndre Swift isn't getting the rushing touchdowns, eventually he's going to get those going in his direction. He's going to get the receiving utilization. He's taken on a defense that's allowing over 11 fantasy points per game on the ground, 4.5 yards per carry on average, and have allowed over 94 rushing yards to opposing running backs in each of the last 4 games over 100 rushing yards to Cincinnati in both of the last two matchups. Therefore, I would assume there's a possibility in which DeAndre Swift, functioning as the Chase Brown of this offense, can very easily find himself success, considering what the Bears do best over the course of their season, especially post-bye week, is run the rock. Moving on to our number 25, we have Breece Hall. In the last 6 quarters that he has played with Tyrod Taylor, he has had 6 receptions and 8 total targets. The Ravens are 13.5-point favorites, so the passing script is going to have to be relevant. So hopefully Tyrod Taylor, who has been a functionable quarterback in the National Football League, who led them to nearly beating the Tampa Bay Buccaneers earlier this season when he started in Week 3 post-concussion of Justin Fields and has now been named the starter, Tyrod Taylor can hopefully lead to Breece Hall finding the promised land and justifying as a potential top 24 option outside of the receiving utilization and, of course, getting himself at least ample opportunity share within the rushing category, like this most recent week 14 rushing attempts. Unless he's going to get that ample opportunity, he really is a high-end RB3. Number 26 is Zach Charbonnet. As 13.5-point favorites, taking on the Tennessee Titans, it feels like a guaranteed touchdown game. Again, it's the 7th best matchup, 4.56 yards per carry on average, over 16 fantasy points per game. And even though Kenneth Walker's most recently scoring touchdowns down near the goal line, we're still presented opportunity every single week in which Zach Charbonnet could very easily score a touchdown, as he has scored 4 rushing touchdowns in the last 7 games. Now, very similar to Zach Charbonnet, we have David Montgomery as 10.5-point favorites taking on the New York Giants, taking on the 9th best matchup, 5.58 yards per carry on average, 16 fantasy points per game. A defense that's allowed a rushing touchdown and 88 plus rushing yards in each of the last 4 games. You would assume that David Montgomery would be in line to potentially scoring a touchdown, assuming Jahmyr Gibbs doesn't score every single rushing touchdown within the upcoming contest, which again, I'm sure there are going to be many of considering the matchup, should be one-sided as 10.5-point favorites. Number 28, speaking of this matchup, as 10.5-point underdogs, the New York Giants starting running back Tyrone Tracy is going to have to heavily lean upon the receiving category, coming off a week in which he had 4 receptions for 51 yards with Jameis Winston, but also 19 rushing attempts for 88 yards. This week's script is probably going to not lead to very much so running the ball at that capacity, and even though in this most recent game we did see a lot of Devin Singletary scoring rushing touchdowns, if Jackson Dart is to return, and Devin Singletary continues to get that utilization, the overall limit and peak of potential for Tracy is limited because, again, you got to remember that Jackson Dart has scored 7 rushing touchdowns in the last 7 games he has played. And if Devin Singletary is also going to be in the mix there, Tyrone Tracy purely going to have to rely upon the volume of yardage and receptions to carry his week, and number 28 is relatively safe there. 29. We have Kyle Monangai coming off of scoring 3 rushing touchdowns in the last 5 games, but scoring a rushing touchdown specifically in back-to-back games, which has continued to keep him fantasy relevant for another consecutive week. As long as he continues to get himself opportunity, it leads to success because he has been such an efficient runner within this offense that succeeds within the rushing category. But over the course of the last 3 games in which he has had 10 or more touches, every single game 10 or more fantasy points. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football, and taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers is not a matchup I'm afraid of, as they have allowed over 94 rushing yards to each of the last 4 backfields they have taken on: Cincinnati twice, the Chargers, and then Green Bay. And I truly do believe that the Bears rushing scheme is just as relevant, if not better, than all 3 of those teams that I just mentioned: the Chargers, Cincinnati Bengals, and Green Bay Packers. That might be close. Continuing on, we have our number 30, Bhayshul Tuten. The reality of the situation is, if in fact he is healthy, he's going to be relevant. They're taking on the 5th best matchup, allowing nearly 19 fantasy points per game, nearly 5 yards per carry, and have allowed 100 yards and 2 touchdowns to San Francisco, 181 and 2 touchdowns to Seattle, 86 to Dallas, 72 and 2 touchdowns to Green Bay. Again, backfields have continued to destroy this Arizona defense. Therefore, if in fact Bhayshul Tuten is healthy, considering the fact that their deployment between Tuten and Etienne had no rhyme or no reason, we would anticipate for Tuten to be relevant once again, just waiting his overall status considering the ankle injury that he did sustain on Sunday. Number 31 is Sean Tucker. In the event in which Bucky Irving is active, Sean Tucker, I'm assuming, is still going to be relevant. In the event in which Sean Tucker is the lone back and Bucky Irving is inactive this week, I may in fact put him in the B tier because of the lack of contributions that we may see from Rachaad White going forward, considering Sean Tucker just came away with 106 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns in this most recent game. I mean, he scored 5 total touchdowns in the last 5 games. He's a far more efficient runner than Rachaad White, and I do believe that Bucky Irving, even if he is active, is going to be limited to not getting the entire opportunity of his backfield. Moving on to our number 32, we have Kenneth Gainwell. Look, his overall utilization was even prior to Jaylen Warren's ankle injury. Therefore, if going forward, we're going to continue to see Kenneth Gainwell utilized at a high clip in comparison to earlier this season, then of course he'll be relevant, but his overall contributions were made through the receiving category. In the event in which Jaylen Warren was to miss, I want to point you back to that game against Minnesota earlier this season in London, in a game in which, of course, he dominated and scored over 20 fantasy points. If that opportunity presents itself once again, can be relevant. Otherwise, if Warren's going to be limited or potentially not at a full 100% rate, Kenneth Gainwell could continue to get more looks as we proceed. Number 33, we have Bam Knight. In the case in which Trey Benson misses another week, which he is most likely going to do because if he doesn't get himself a full participation or practice by Friday, taking on Jacksonville's already a difficult matchup, we have Bam Knight to be the number one running back of this offense. Coming off of a game in which, yes, Jacoby Brissett set the record for the most completions by a quarterback in NFL history in a single game, but also coming off of a game in which he scored a rushing touchdown, but easily should have had a second rushing touchdown as he had a 60-yard rushing touchdown called back in the beginning of the second half. Number 34 is Devin Singletary, who continues to be relevant now, is taking goal line opportunities. In the event in which Jackson Dart is absent, Devin Singletary easily a top 34 option. Considering the matchup, over the course of the last 3 weeks, they've allowed Minnesota go for 114 yards, Washington 71 and a touchdown, and the Philadelphia Eagles for 117. Detroit's defense is not going to be one that you can't run the ball on. It's just a matter of, does the game script allow for it within the matchup? 35 is Tyjae Spears. Speaking of game script, taking on the Seahawks pretty much guarantees a negative script with a 12.5-point underdog mentality. Again, this is an elite run-stopping defense, considering Tyjae Spears has had 3+ receptions in 5 consecutive games, but in this most recent week coming off of 5 catches, hopefully the receiving utilization will be enough to keep him top 36 relevant. The final running back I wanted to mention is Rhamondre Stevenson. When you're taking on the Bengals, who have allowed over 100 rushing yards to opposing running backs for 9 straight games, and they are, of course, allowing 5.81 yards per carry on average since week 5, and are allowing over 20.5 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs on the ground, you would assume that if, in fact, Rhamondre Stevenson is active, that even in the event in which TreVeyon Henderson continues to lead this backfield, Rhamondre Stevenson will still get enough run to be a top 36 relevant back. All right, that's going to cover it in regards to my top 36 running back rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'm going to close out today's video by reminding you that if you guys haven't yet already, check out the Patreon. It's a way in which you can get rankings every Thursday and, of course, Sunday. These rankings being at every single position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, and flex for both half and full PPR. And, of course, you can individually ask me questions. So if you have any waiver wire questions for tonight's waivers or any trade questions as your deadline is approaching, be sure to go ahead and send me a message on Patreon once you guys sign up via the 2025 Fantasy Football Championship tier. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll be back later tonight live streaming on the channel. Hope to see you there. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.